I'm gonna show you how to do this segment of your shirt, which is the front placket pieces. They're sometimes they're attached to the pattern. They're all come in one piece. Other times they're a separate pattern piece. So in this particular pattern, they are a separate pattern piece. You can see from the pattern envelope here, this little piece down the front. So it's actually a separate piece. So I'm going to take the front, it's called the front band. So it's, it may not say the word placket, but you're looking for a front band. It's usually almost always a nice long piece that's the same length as the front of your shirt piece, which I'm going to lift this up. See how far up I can go. So here's my shirt piece here, and my front placket piece is actually going to get sewn right on along here. I've taken this small pattern piece or narrow pattern piece, cut two out of it, and interfaced it. Because it is a band that you're going to have buttonholes on, you do want to have interfacing in it, even if you were using it as like snaps or whatever. Interfacing down that front band just gives it a little bit of extra body and stability. So I've cut my two pieces out and I've interfaced them. So on this pattern piece, up the very middle of it is my center fold. So I've taken and I've folded my placket piece or band piece directly in half, matching up my two raw edges. So now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew these on to the front piece of my shirt. Okay, so I've got my front piece. Now, in the actual construction of your shirt, the order that you will have done it is you will have done your front piece, and you will have done any darts in it. You will have attached it at the shoulders to the back. So if your back has a yoke, or if it's just a solid back, or whatever, if there's back darts in it, you will have done your back darts, attached your front and your back to the shoulder, attached your side seams, or put your sleeves in first in a flat manner, then sewn under the armhole, up the side of the shirt and down the sleeve to sew in the sleeves, and then you come to this point. So what has to be done is once your side seams are sewn, you want to hem your shirt. So you hem it using a narrow method. This particular shirt has a 5/8 of an inch finished seam. So I've just turned it up and I'm doing just a very narrow 1/4 inch double folded hem on it. So I've hemmed my shirt. So now I'm taking my front piece, and right here I have a notch on the center front piece. On my placket or my band piece, I also have a notch right at the top. So I'm going to match those two pieces, those two notches on the center front. I'm opening this piece that I've folded and pressed down. I'm opening this up. So you'll know you've got the right piece if they line up at the top, which they do. So I'm going to take this into my machine, and at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is what my pattern requires, I'm going to start to sew this. And you can pin along the front here if you need to. I think I can probably get through this. So I'm keeping it right at 5/8. And I'm sewing all the way down to the bottom. So remember, this is right sides together. So when I come down and I get close to the bottom, you're going to see that my hemmed area, there's actually going to be my band piece is going to be a little bit too long, and that's fine. That's exactly the way it's supposed to be. So I'm just going to sew right down to the bottom and back stitch. So you can see I've sewn this there. Let's get that. I've got this sewn right to the bottom. Now I've got, if I measure this out, I've got about 3/4 of an inch extra along the bottom. Ideally, I would have wanted that to be 5/8 of an inch, but possibly I did some pattern alterations to this blouse, so maybe I've got it a little bit shorter in the blouse, which is fine because I've done the alterations needed. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this off so that this extension at the bottom is 5/8 of an inch. So now what I want to do is I want to take this to my iron and I want to press my seam allowance towards the band. So I'm pressing both in towards the band, and then I'm going to press my outer edge of the band. I'm going to take and press it down at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, I've pressed my edge in towards my band. I've also gone in and I've trimmed out the band seam allowance. I've trimmed it down to about 1/4 of an inch just to get rid of some of the bulk in there. I've pressed my other raw edge of my band down at 5/8. So, and I've gone back and I've repressed and made sure that this is the inside of my shirt. I've made sure that when it's all pressed out, I don't see any stitching along here, that this is covering it. And when I look from the right side, it's all nice and even. So I've pressed the right side again. So the next row of stitching that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom, and you see how I've got my band here. I've got an extended piece of the band. So I'm going to fold it back on itself so that the right sides are together. And I've just clipped, you can see where the fold line was, so that I knew that I had it folded right back on itself. So I'm going to run a row of stitching right along, catching only the band, but catching it so that when it's turned, it's going to be flush with the hem edge of my shirt. So I'm just going to sew this here. Sew it nice and straight across. Clip my threads. Trim out anything extra here, and I usually clip on an angle at the corner. So now I've got this, I can turn and flip it. You may need to use a little point turner, but you see when you look at this that this is the bottom edge, so it's nice and flush. So now I'm going to top stitch my band. You can do this either on the front or the back. If you're confident in where you've got your placket folded over and you know you're going to catch it, then you get a nice even row on the top. This is one area where I might take and pin this down. Now you can pin it so that your pins are done horizontally down the middle. If you've pressed really well, then your crease, you've got your fold in. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in here. And when I do stitch this, I'm going to stitch it at 1/4 of an inch from the placket or the band side where it's attached to my shirt, and I'm going to stitch it at 1/4 of an inch on the other side just to have them both even. Now you can go narrower than this. You can stitch this at 1/8 on either side, or whatever you choose. So on my machine, actually my 1/4 of an inch is just so that my side of my presser foot is flush with the edge of that where the band and the shirt are sewn on. So I'll take these pins out as I go where I need to. Some of them I'm able to actually pass right by. So I'm keeping my eye in front here, trying to keep that straight rather than looking at where my needle is going down. Try to find a reference point on your sewing machine or on your presser foot that you can watch rather than watching the needle when you're stitching. You'll get a much straighter row of stitching that way. I've got a thread there. Back stitch at the end. So you can see how I've got a nice, hopefully you can see, usually I use a contrasting thread, but I've got a nice matching thread. So on the reverse side, I've covered everything over. Now, you could go in and hand stitch that down if you feel that there might be a raw edge that you see. I don't have any raw edges showing, so that will be fine in the wash. So I'm just going to go along the other side. You want to do whichever distance you did on the side where the placket and the band and the shirt are attached. You want to make sure that you're doing the same on the opposite side so that your stitching is centered. And then your buttonholes will go right down the middle of this. And I think I've just run out of thread. So I'll show you. So you can see here I've got my placket. So this would be the area that I'm going to put my buttonholes in. So your buttonhole placement on your shirt, when you get, after you've finished your collar, your sleeves, everything is done, buttonholes are one of the last things that you do. You want to try your shirt on, and if you have a mirror, stand in front of it, you want to make sure that you mark the buttonhole that is going to be at the widest part of your bust. So your full bust measurement is where you want to make sure you put a buttonhole. That way you won't have any gaping. So then you just position your buttonholes, whether they're 3 inches or 2.5 inches above, and you just position them from that point. That's the key buttonhole to start. Then you also want to make sure if you're buttoning it all the way up, you want to make sure that your first buttonhole on your shirt is below where the collar is, and it's usually half the width of the buttonhole, or half the width of the button is where the buttonhole starts down from your 5/8 seam where your collar is. So those two, once you determine those two, you can figure out the distance in between and put them all so that they're all of an equal distance.